The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 47.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library. Today we have Brad Stone, author of The Everything Store. Welcome, Brad, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thank you, Wade.
Will you take just a moment to introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you personally?
Sure. My name is Brad Stone. I'm a senior writer at Bloomberg Businessweek magazine. I'm also the author of the book, The Everything Store, Jeff Bezos and the Age of Amazon. It was published by Little Brown, came out last October, won the Goldman Sachs and Financial Times Business Book of the Year award, and just came out in paperback.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Now let's jump right into that book, The Everything Store, which was made available originally on October 15th, 2013, with the paperback just releasing last month, correct? Oh, I'm sorry, it's still
That's
August. Right. Okay. By the time this airs, I guess it'll be last month. But Brad, we're going to move fairly quickly. But here are some of the top questions that our listeners, who are made of entrepreneurial readers, would like to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing The Everything Store?
I've covered Silicon Valley for about 15 years now for the New York Times, Newsweek magazine, and now Businessweek. And in that time, I've seen a lot of my colleagues write great books about the other technology companies that are changing our lives. So there have been many Google books. There have been a couple Facebook books. There is like a whole genre of Apple books. You know, Amazon, by virtue, I think, of its secrecy, the fact that it's up in Seattle, no one had done a great job writing a book about the company. And you know, this is a company that has changed the way that we read, the way that we shop, the way companies are being formed in the cloud. And you know, I thought it was time for an in-depth look at its history and on all the obstacles that it had to navigate.
So you alluded to the second question already a little bit, but really it's what makes your book different from others regarding the same topic?
Sure. There are a couple of other books about Amazon. There were a couple of very good early ones that are just incomplete by virtue of the fact that they were written in 2001, 2002. There's one called Get Big Fast that offers a pretty good look at just the first 5 years of Amazon. There are a couple of memoirs written by former employees that are decent. One by the comedian Mike Daisey. There's another one called Amazonia, written by a guy who worked as an editor at Amazon's book group. But you know, those were old, and I think, you know, because Amazon almost went out of business in 2001, 2002, people stopped tracking it as closely, and then suddenly with the release of the Kindle, the emergence of Amazon Web Services, and its pioneering work in the cloud, people began to pay attention again. But nobody had really gone in depth with some access and cooperation from the company, and talked to, you know, the hundreds of employees that were there witnessing the revolution, had great stories to tell. So I think, you know, my book sort of stands apart because, you know, it shows the rise, the near fall, and then the rise again. And you know, I think, you know, just to toot my own horn a little bit, but you know, I spent 2 years talking to, you know, people who were there, got some cooperation from the company, from Jeff Bezos, from his family members, and so was able to do enough that you could really tell this incredible entrepreneurial story.
And how do you suggest the reader engage with your book? Is this the kind of book they can use as a resource and jump in and out based on different chapters and what they need at the moment? Or is this really one that they should start from the beginning and read all the way through?
Yeah, I really conceived it as a story. So I never imagined that people would just pop in. I mean, I do think there are business lessons there, not lessons from me, but lessons from, you know, Jeff Bezos and how he operates Amazon. The company is incredibly customer focused. The way they run meetings, you know, there are all sorts of lessons that you can draw, good ones and maybe some ones to avoid. But you know, my book is really a story. It starts with you know, a kid who is you know, gifted, living in Texas. It goes to a gifted school, and then really takes you through, you know, his time in Wall Street at the hedge fund D.E. Shaw, you know, all the way to the present day. So it is a, you know, one of my mantras writing it was find the straight line. You know, the Amazon story has so many overlapping parts, and But I really wanted it to be a kind of a gripping narrative for readers.
Great. So Brad, now that we know the background behind the book, we're to my favorite part where we're really going to take a deep dive. And I'm going to hand off the mic and just ask you to take us through really from front to back and let this, this is I guess who you're imagining you're talking to is a reader who's thinking about picking up your book and wondering if it's going to be their next great read.
Right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak to that prospective reader. I structured my book in three parts. I guess I'm a former English major, so taking that clue from great plays, but it really conformed to Amazon's history, which I sort of saw in three parts. The first part, I call it faith in the book, is the years 1993 to about early 2000 when the stock market collapses. And Jeff Bezos is a vice president at the hedge fund D.E. Shaw, and he is working with the brilliant founder of that company, David Shaw, to brainstorm internet ideas. And among their ideas, they come upon this notion for the Everything Store. Can you create, on this new growing thing called the World Wide Web, can you create an intermediary between customers and manufacturers? And Bezos has the entrepreneurial bug. And he decides that he wants to be a guy like David Shaw, who himself had left Morgan Stanley to start his own firm. And Bezos, with his wife, drives across the country and starts the company that they would later call Amazon. So I start in the basement, in the garage of their Bellevue house after he's left D.E. Shaw, hiring the first employees. And the reason I call part one faith is because there really wasn't, the internet was new. Startups today, can look to Google or Amazon and have so many patterns to match, so many best practices to duplicate. The reason I called the first part faith is because Bezos and his colleagues and his investors were completely making it up as they went along. To the extent that they were driving packages to the post office and running into the basement to pack boxes themselves. It wasn't a very efficient operation, but there was a faith, a belief that the internet was this huge revolution that was going to change not just retailing, but the way business was conducted. It was going to level the playing field. It was going to let customers, weigh in with reviews of products. And Bezos was the guy who really bet the biggest on that belief, on that faith. He even to this day, raised the most amount of money probably of any internet entrepreneur, period, when you consider the initial fundraising rounds, the IPO, the initial bond offerings. And so that first part is like the story of this incredible bet. He's at the casino of business and he's betting it all on green. And I take in that first part, I take the reader through the initial Amazon fundraising rounds and the IPO and the initial battles. When they met the Riggio brothers who run Barnes and Noble. And when they met the folks who ran Walmart for the first time. The other thing I talk about is about Bezos sort of finding his way and creating Amazon's culture, driving people relentlessly. It's something that he still does today, just sets the pace. Everyone's familiar with startups with, founders that ultimately end up bickering. Well, Amazon had an original employee named Shel Kaufman, and I tell his story, and he was employee number one, and unfortunately him and Jeff didn't end up getting along, and he left early, so that is also recounted. And then that first part, faith, brings us up to the what we call the dot-com bubble. Although we may have to change that because we might be in another bubble now. But this is when almost everybody lost their minds, and Amazon did too. They were making a ton of acquisitions. They were starting new product categories. They were borrowing a ton of money. Jeff had his foot on the accelerator, and to me, it's a thrilling part of the book because Amazon does things with such discipline now, so it's hard to remember that back then, he wasn't as accomplished a CEO as he is today. They were doing a lot of good things to build their brand, but he was making a ton of mistakes. He bought a lot of companies. He overspent. They learned a lot, but the company almost really went out of business. And the very end of that first part, faith, takes us into the dot-com bust. There were analysts that were predicting Amazon would go out of business, and Jeff basically changed direction, took its foot off the accelerator, had to lay people off, but reached profitability. And at the end, I love this detail from the book, but he inserted a secret code into a press release to ridicule one of the analysts that had predicted Amazon would go out of business. So that takes us kind of the end of part one, this incredible rise, and then Amazon basically surviving by the skin of its teeth when a lot of its rivals, similarly overextended, went out of business. Part two, I call literary influences, because I'm dealing with a lot in that chapter. But the unifying principle of this part of the book is, at all these different parts of his life, Jeff found key insight and lessons from books. So the first chapter of that section, I go back in time and talk about Jeff's upbringing. And not a lot of people knew this until my book was published, but Jeff's dad was not his biological dad. His biological dad, who he never knew, was actually, in a detail you just can't make up, was a circus performer and a unicycle expert. And I tell that story. Tell the story of Jeff's his stepdad, who he really considers his father, who was an immigrant from Cuba. I talk about Jeff's early years, and then some of his space aspirations. And then we get back into Amazon, and there's three different sections here. One, there's the formation of the fulfillment network, those huge warehouses, which is really, their expertise there is at the heart of everything Amazon does. And I talk about the books that Jeff Bezos and Jeff Wilke, his right-hand man, and others learned from. Then there's a chapter about, which is really a chapter about the creation of Amazon's prowess in the cloud. I call it a technology company, not a retailer, because it's really when Amazon kind of embraced its identity as a technology company and learned to build technology around price matching and search. And there were a lot of failures along the way, a lot of internal conflict, which I talk about. And then the last chapter in that section is about the creation of the Kindle. And again, there are books that provided the inspiration, books like The Innovator's Dilemma. Amazon saw what Apple had done in music with the iPod, and and having read Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, knew they really had to take the initiative to disrupt their own business, or somebody else would do it. And Amazon's core business at that point, a big part of its business and a big part of its brand identity, was books. And so, they knew nothing about creating hardware, but Bezos himself, really over the objections of a lot of his key lieutenants, basically made the statement that they're going to have to learn how to do hardware, learn how to build an e-reader, because otherwise, somebody else would come along and disrupt them. So that's literary influences. It's really covers the most formative time in Amazon's history, when it came up with Amazon Prime, the 2-day subscription service, and when Bezos himself, taking the lessons of the business books that he loved and applying them at the company, directed Amazon into the cloud and into hardware with the Kindle, which has led to so much of its strategy today. And so, that second chapter, I really feel like is a sort of rousing account of Amazon having recovered from the dot-com collapse, kind of finding its identity when a lot of people had written it off. I mean, from this point in time, eBay was valued on Wall Street higher than Amazon. Google, which went public during this time, right away was valued much higher than Amazon. So that part two is the story of an underdog counted out by everyone who, manages through ingenuity and the relentless motivation of its founder to basically get its house in order, set its traditional business on firm footing, and then to build on top of it and to really pioneer a couple of industries. So if part two it sort of ends on that up note, part three maybe sounds a more cautious tone about Amazon's growing power, and I title that part. And here you probably hear me kind of thumbing through my book. The part three is titled "Missionary or Mercenary," and this is a formulation that's popular in Silicon Valley, and Jeff uses it too. Missionaries at companies have high ideals and big lofty goals. In Amazon's case, they want to be the most customer-focused company in the world. In the case of like its Kindle division, they want to make every book ever written available for download within 60 seconds. Jeff really believes that missionary employees and missionary companies do better than mercenary companies. And as you can guess, mercenary companies are they're out to win. They're out to best competitors. They're out to turn a quick buck. Well, Amazon identifies obviously as the missionary company, but in part 3, I examine really what might some consider at least to be some mercenary practices. So it starts in the late 2000s with the acquisition of Zappos and some other moves, some of its disputes in the publishing business. And then we get right into all the ways in which Amazon exerts its market power. And this runs the gamut. There's a battle over sales taxes where, despite the fact that it locates in various states, it claims not to have physical presence in those locations. Often it's using sort of, legal loopholes to call a fulfillment center, to claim a fulfillment center belongs to another company. And so it doesn't have to collect sales tax. That battle was waged over many years. Amazon was ultimately forced to start collecting sales tax. Other kind of areas of mercenary behavior, as we now know, is almost less clear a year ago. Amazon can have a very antagonistic relationship with the suppliers that sell on its site. So I tell the story of a knife maker called Wusthof that found because Amazon has such a drive to achieve the lowest price, that when Wusthof allowed Amazon to sell its knives on the site, it ended up putting all sorts of pressure on Wustof's other retailers, the small shops that had made its brand in the United States, and which it really valued. Amazon started to behave a little bit like Walmart in that it wanted the absolute lowest everyday price. And it wanted special relationships with suppliers, and that creates a lot of pressure on manufacturers. It's why we've seen so many jobs migrate overseas, because manufacturers try to accommodate these low-margin retailers. And then I get a little bit more into the dispute with between Amazon and the publishers, how Apple got involved and tried to help publishers set a higher price, and that unfortunately attracted the attention of the U.S. Justice Department. And then in I think one of the best gets from the book, I have a memo from Jeff himself, which is called the Amazon.love memo, and it's in this third part of the book, which is Jeff really thinking to his executive staff about how Amazon, as a scale discount retailer, can be loved by its customers and not feared, as so many scale retailers like Walmart are. And he's sort of thinking out loud, how, as we get big, how do we make sure that we don't get put in that Walmart bucket? And one of the things he concludes is that as long as they're seen as innovative, as fundamentally inventing new things, then customers will kind of give them a pass. We'll see if that's true, but it's clearly something. Every time they talk about something like drones, or they get into a new market like phones with the Fire Phone, we're seeing Amazon, I think, invent. I mean, practically they've got goals, operational goals with those new initiatives, but they also, I think, want to be seen as an innovative company, because their core business, to some, will always be unsympathetic, because you're putting small, local, in some cases mom and pop shops out of business. Finally, I get to the last chapter of the book, which I call the kingdom of the question mark, and I do a lot in that chapter. The first thing I do is I tell the story of how I went and I found Jeff's biological father. This is the unicyclist, and I tell that story, and to my surprise, when I was reporting it, he didn't even know that his biological son had grown up to be one of the most famous executives in the world. He was running a bike shop outside of Phoenix. I found him, and I told basically him the story of the son that he had as a teenager. And from there, changing gears, I get into the culture of Amazon in the early 2000 teens. I call it the kingdom of the question mark, because one of the ways Jeff Bezos manages such a huge business is when he sees something he doesn't like, when he hears from a customer about a complaint, he'll often send it to the executive at Amazon in charge of that particular part of the business with just a question mark on the email. And if you're an Amazon employee and you get the question mark, you basically run into panic mode. And that was my entree into describing a culture which is very unique, it's very idiosyncratic, and which isn't for the faint of heart. Jeff has a very high bar, like so many founder CEOs, like Steve Jobs and Larry Page, and he demands his employees think big all the time and bring their very best to meetings. They have the customer in mind always. All these principles are codified in the Amazon's leadership values, which I talk about in that chapter as well. And then finally, at the end, I talk a little bit about what I think is coming. And it's funny because everything I predicted at the end of the hardcover edition ended up coming true. I mean, it wasn't rocket science, but they released a telephone, they released a set-top box, they expanded into new countries. Unfortunately, I didn't predict the drone announcement, but I was able to update the book recently. There's a new chapter in the paperback. In that new epilogue, I talk about the tragic death of Amazon's first chief financial officer, Joy Covey, and it kind of brought the Amazon community back together. There was a memorial for her, and in many ways, it was sort of a reunion of the cast of characters from the Everything Store. And it also, had them all in a kind of period of reflection about what they had accomplished over the last 15 years. I touch on life in an Amazon customer service call center, where you have, hundreds of employees answering the telephone, because people, I think, generally now know what it's like in an Amazon fulfillment center, but life is as equally difficult in these customer call centers. And because they're Amazon employees, they're measured based on things like how many calls they answer, and how customers answer the poll that they're emailed after a customer service call. So I want readers to be clear-eyed about Amazon. It's an incredibly innovative company, but it's also putting a lot of pressure on its partners and on its employees. And that, Wade, is the Everything Store. And I hope there are a lot of lessons for entrepreneurs, but I also just hope it's a great story, because the story of Amazon really is one of the great entrepreneurial stories of our age. When you think of how much this company has accomplished in what is now 20 years, it's mind-blowing. I mean, Amazon will be the fastest retailer to 100 billion in sales this year, maybe next year, and they've gone and basically pioneered a new kind of retail and digital reading, cloud computing in the process. So I have a ton of admiration for the company. I hope that comes through in the book, but I also think we need to understand it, because it's almost a different corporate creature than anything that we've seen before.
Wow, Brad, you have a gift of storytelling. That is for sure. And you said at the very beginning, absolutely. You said at the very beginning that one of the things that made your book different was how thorough it was. And it honestly, I'm thinking if I was Jeff Bezos, I might pick this up to learn a little bit about my own company, because I think he would actually learn some things.
Well, unfortunately, I think that he did pick it up, and there wasn't a lot of love from the company. They saw it as a critique or an attack, and thought elements of it, like the depiction of the culture, were inaccurate. And I didn't expect them or need for them to love it. I wish they had liked it more than they did. But sometimes I think when you believe as fiercely as they believe, an outsider's portrayal can be bothersome. So perhaps it's not all that surprising that they didn't like it.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. Like you said, an outsider's view is always going to be different of what's actually going in on the inside. But also, I like to think of myself as a certain person, but if I was to poll the 10 people closest to me, they're all going to say probably something different than what what I would.
That's right.
A strength of mine might be an overbearance or something that they don't like. So that's that definitely makes sense. But you did a great job of running through the book. I mean, it was fantastic. I can't believe it how much different angles you came at it. And like you said, there are a lot of different lessons to be pulled out of it. And I think that's what makes this next question, so difficult to answer. And that's, if the reader can only take away one concept, principle, or action item out of your entire book, what would you want that to be?
Well, if we're talking about a business reader, then I really think that, and this is going to sound a little bit like common sense, but Amazon, and it's a little hypey, but they really do pride themselves on putting the customers first and, as they would say, raising the bar for what it means to be a customer-focused company. Okay, so that's easy to say, but and I'm sure, let's just take the example of an airline. I'm sure they would consider themselves to be very customer-focused. But you get into an airline today, and let's say they have a video screen in the seat in front of you, and that video screen is playing ads until you take off, and maybe the ads are coming out through the cabin audio. There's so many examples we can point to in life where a company has done something completely not even taking the customer experience into account. That's a business objective. There's no one that's thought for a second to think, is this a good customer experience? Or and if we were to take a more long-term approach, shouldn't we not play that ad? Shouldn't we, as other airlines do, like, play great music or give viewers choices of what to do on their video screen while they're just sitting there waiting for the plane to take off? And the one thing that Amazon does well is they always think about how to make the experience a little better for customers. For the canonical example at Amazon is, if you go to buy an item on the site that you've already bought, they're going to warn you about that before you make the purchase again. They started an advertising business since we're talking about ads, on their Kindle Fire tablets. These are not interruptive ads. They're ads that show up on the screensaver, where you could ignore them or you could watch them. I mean, they really do think, as they release every product, about how to make it a little better of an experience. And I think that a lot of people pay lip service to customers and users, but only when you really see it implemented as a cultural value at a company like Amazon, does it resonate. It's like, oh yeah, well, like, all these companies could be treating us a little better. I was recently renting a car, and it was a horrendous experience of just waiting, for that attendant to go and, take down my information, because I had already RSVP'd, but I was waiting half an hour. At Amazon, they would start by rethinking the process and putting the customer at the center. What can we do with technology now to make that onboarding process easier? And it's why some people root for an Amazon to come into a market, because they really do kind of raise the bar for being customer focused. And if you're an old line business, you can't screw around anymore and put your corporate priorities ahead of your customer priorities. So I think my book shows Amazon in a lot of different stages of its growth, and a lot of different iterations, shifting priorities, shifting strategies. But the one thing that really has remained consistent is the customer focus. And I'd love to get on an airplane or rent a car or turn on a cable channel, and where that kind of thinking is embodied.
Very good. And Brad, do you have a favorite quote from your book? It can be something that you wrote yourself, or something that, obviously you got around a lot of different people to write this book, but do you have a favorite quote?
Well, yeah, there's one. I mean, all the best quotes from Jeff, like, who can compete with the philosopher entrepreneur? There was a quote of his that I have at the very end of the book. It's the last page of the last chapter of the hardcover edition. And the quote, I just think it explains so much of Amazon's kind of relentless drive, what it views as its own underdog status, and how it thinks about new businesses. So the quote is this: "We don't have a single big advantage, so we have to weave a rope of many small advantages." And that is Jeff Bezos talking to a publisher named Tim O'Reilly. Now, I just see so much what Amazon does as weaving that rope of small advantages. So, for instance, they came out with their phone recently, the Fire Phone. There's a Prime subscription that comes with that. There are free videos in the Prime instant video service that you can watch on the Fire Phone. There's an app on the phone. I think it's called Firefly, that lets you just use the camera to scan any product, and there it is, available for sale on Amazon with the price. So this is not a phone as a Samsung or even a Google would introduce it. I mean, this is a link in a chain that Bezos has been building for 20 years. And when he does kind of nutty things, this actually recently he bought an online gaming network called Twitch TV, where people can watch video games. And in and of itself, it's a head scratcher. But think of it as a link in the chain, the rope that he is weaving. This is another channel in the lineup of video offerings that he's been creating, both funding the creation of unique content shows like the comedy Alpha House that Amazon is into. It's also licensing shows from networks like AMC and HBO. And then now they've just added another channel to their lineup, Twitch TV. So, that's how I view Amazon. We're weaving a rope because it just constitutionally believes that, unlike a Google that's got the huge advantage of being a dominant search engine, Amazon operates from this sort of perception of, we don't have really an advantage other than the fact that people love our brand. And so we've got to work hard for everything. And just watching Bezos and his colleagues work, they're such tacticians. And I think that quote kind of sums it up.
That was an excellent quote. And Brad, I think that there's a ton of, like we've already discussed, a ton of great lessons and information that they can gather from this. And I think that for some people, this can really be a paradigm-shifting book. And that leads us to our last question, which is, what's a paradigm-shifting book or a book that you've read that has left a huge impact on you? And will you share that with our audience?
Okay, that's a tough one, obviously, because when I think of influential books, I could go back to my childhood where I plowed through the books of Kurt Vonnegut, and I feel like his sensibility, changed my worldview. But I'll go with something more recent. I mean, obviously, I love novels, I love fiction, and I am just so into the works of David Mitchell. He's an Irish writer, and I won't even mention one, but because they're all, it's almost like his 6 or 7 novels are all part of the same tapestry. So there's a book, it was made into a movie called Cloud Atlas. He's got another novel called The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet. And there's one called Black Swan Green. There's a little sci-fi. There's a lot of history. He actually in a lot of his books, he tells short stories, but he links them all together, and then it kind of doubles back, and he goes back into the first stories. And every story kind of hands a baton to the next. First of all, he's such a good writer. It's so enjoyable. And then the way these stories are interconnected, and the way he has created a whole universe populated with characters that show up in one book to the next, I think is, to me as a writer, it's just been so inspiring. And I love any book right now that can transport us out of this, environment of immediacy and nonstop news. So his books have really kind of changed my life over the past few years, and I highly, highly recommend them.
Very good. Well, Brad, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to get more information on you and your book, The Everything Store?
Sure. Well, I've got a website, brad-stone.com. I also have a page on Business Week. You could just put my name into the Business Week search engine and see all the cover stories and other articles that I write for Business Week. And then you could always go, let's say you could go to your friendly local neighborhood bookstore and talk to the guy behind the counter and ask if they've got the Everything Store and strike up a conversation, because I could send you to Amazon, but that's too easy, and we got to support our local bookstores. Otherwise, they're not going to be there next year, and if you value them, you should probably shop there.
Excellent. Well, Brad, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your creation with us.
Thank you, Wade.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like to get your hands on the Everything Store or any of the other resources mentioned by Brad, just look at the show notes at theelpodcast.com. If there is a book you would love to hear reviewed by the author, please visit us on iTunes and leave us a review with that book title.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to theelpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's theelpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.